Anyway, so I'm obviously Nina McLemore. We do book signings here in the store of people who are our customers and other people of interest whom, whom we find their topics would be interesting to our customers. Anyway, so we're supposed to be doing this live, but we're video cam, but we're not. So we have Stephenie Foster.
Also a neighbor of Nina's.
Yes. And Susan Markham, to discuss her new book, Feminist Foreign Policy in Theory and in Practice. Given the military conflicts, the economic and climate challenges, and authoritarian regimes today, among other things, I think this is a very timely topic. Now the question is, what is feminism? I'm one of those people who was around when in the 60s when we started talking about it, I think. So in their book, they describe feminism is the idea that all people, regardless of gender, should have equal political, economic, cultural opportunity and rights. There are three core words that keep repeating in this book, and those are women, peace, and security. So women must be involved in all aspects of conflict prevention, peace building, post-conflict reconstruction, and humanitarian relief. And too often, women are not at the table and not in the room. So these authors have extensive international experience in promoting women's involvement in politics around the world. Stephenie and Susan are co-founders of something called Smash Strategies. I didn't ever ask you why you named it that, but that's we will get to that. Stephenie is a former senior advisor to the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. She's a senior advisor to the coordinator for Afghan relocation efforts in the U.S. She spent 2 years, or 2 winters, as she said, in Kabul in 2013 and 2012 and 13. She is a former executive in residence at the AU Women in Politics Institute, which, if those of you who are not on that mailing list and part of it, it's really interesting. She's a lawyer by training and worked for Senator Barbara Mikulski. There's a whole group of Barbara Mikulski alums. And Barbara Mikulski was elected senator in 1987, which is really amazing. Susan is the director of HFXX, the Global Security Initiative, and co-founder of SMASH. She's a former USAID Senior Gender Coordinator and is a course lecturer on gender development and foreign policy for Brown University, Carnegie Mellon, and Georgetown University. She was previously with Emily's List, she started very early, and the National Democratic Institute's International Director of Women's Political Participation. Now that sounds like a lot. My first question is, for Susan, how many countries have you worked in?
I have worked in 52 countries.
52 countries.
Yes. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, from about 2010 to 2014, when we were doing a lot of work there, increasing women's political participation. So some countries I've only been to for a couple days. Those countries I've been to multiple times for lengths of time.
So the question is, why is this moment to write about the feminist foreign policy, which we're going to call FFP for the future? Why is this book needed at this time?
Well, I'll start. We have a little, to set sort of the baseline here of what we're writing about. We thought, I'll say a few things, and then Susan, maybe to answer the question kind of broadly. But really, the reason we wrote this book, besides being asked, of course, which is always a good thing, is that feminist foreign policy as a concept really became part of the global conversation in 2014 when Sweden adopted a feminist foreign policy. It was the first country to do so. There have since been about 15 countries that have, adopted either a feminist foreign policy, development policy, trade policy, but was no book really talking about what this meant across these various countries and in terms of the way that they are sort of trying to implement their commitments. So we were asked to do this, and we really see this book as creating a baseline that can be used both by foreign policy professionals, people who are interested in the topic, students, because it technically is a textbook. But the reason we did this was really to capture what feminist foreign policy means now, what it's based on, and sort of how we see it possibly being applicable in the U.S. So.
And I think the reason the words women, peace, and security are so often in the book is because it really comes out of the movement that came out of Beijing in 1995, the Beijing World Conference for Women, that led up to the UN Security Council passing the Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. So for 23 years, we've been working around this women, peace, and security agenda, but now part of civil society has become frustrated with that and wanted to expand it to a feminist foreign policy. So WPS, Women, Peace, and Security, is really the framework, one of the frameworks for feminist foreign policy. And so as people, civil society, some governments are talking about feminist foreign policy, we just thought we wanted to differentiate and explain how they were related as well.
So you say that there's not one simple explanation of a definition of FPP, but after researching this book, how would you define it how would you crystallize it so that if you were doing your elevator speech, what would you say?
I would hope that it's a long elevator ride because it's not quite 3 minutes. But I would say that the way Sweden laid it out, many countries based their model of feminist foreign policy on the Swedish model. And civil society has tried to push them further to do more with it. But generally there are 4, I would say, key tenets of it. And the first is that gender equality is both a goal of feminist foreign policy and it's a tool to help achieve it. And so there are many studies, whether it's economically or politically, and even in the security sector, where if a country is working towards gender equality, then it tends to be more peaceful. So it's both the actions that governments take to help women become more equal, also help it become more safe. The second tenet is this idea of security, that security is not just men with guns talking to other men about men and guns, right? It's no longer just the boundaries of a country. Security for a lot of people is about food security. Will I have enough to eat tonight? Is the electricity staying on? Are my kids safe when they're going to or at school? And so it broadens this definition of what security means. It's also about bringing more diverse voices to the table when we're discussing foreign policy. So often, especially in the history of this country, they tend to be older, male, and white, probably go to the same 5 colleges. And so thinking about those who are impacted, obviously bringing in more women, but also thinking about diversity in lots of ways, especially those who are impacted by our foreign policy. And then the last key tenet, I think, is a rebalancing of power. So power within the world, so that the US is not always making the decisions, especially foreign policy decisions for other countries. Within our government, it's rebalancing the power between our diplomacy, development, and defense. Right now, the Defense Department's budget is about 100 times what the budget is of these other 2, development and diplomacy. And so how do we rebalance that to really think about all the tools that we have in our toolbox when we're thinking about how we engage with other countries?
That's a very good answer. It's very clear. You did very well.
Thank you.
So in terms of security, by the way, if you don't travel in taxis and you don't talk to the taxi drivers, you're missing something. So I find I've learned a lot from taxi drivers. So I'm in a taxi going from Penn Station to Union to my office one day in New York, and I don't know how we got into this conversation, but I said that I was really passionate about economic security for women. He said, "You have it wrong." And I waited for the answer. His answer was, first you have to have sustainability. First you have to live. Which I went, okay. So for the security part of it, and you partially answered this. Are you talking about economic security, or military security, freedom from sexual harassment, food? What constitutes security?
Yeah, all of it. I mean, I think that's the thing, and I think, as we look out over the world, if you did a word, I always think, what's the word association with security? People think of, I think, sort of military security, but as we've seen, I think COVID and then all these other things that are happening around us make us understand that security is much broader. It's about food security. It's about the ability to feed your family. It's about health security, the ability to walk down the street in a safe way, to have access to everything that you need. So it's really thinking about security more broadly, not just in terms of, a sort of a militarized view of security. And I think that's something that is intuitive when we think about our lives, but then also when you look across and listen to the voices of women and civil society groups around the world, that's how they're talking about security now in a much broader way, that it's not just freedom from war or freedom from conflict, but the ability to actually build their lives in a way that ensures that their families can be as prosperous as possible and that they're as safe as possible and have access to food and health care and water and electricity and all the things that we need to sustain our lives.
You talked about peace, and there was an article I read recently that gave some statistics on where women are involved in the peace process and the peace and the redevelopment process, that the peace tends to last much longer.
Yeah, I mean there's one study that everyone cites, and I think there's an effort to sort of refresh it, but the studies show that when women are engaged in peace processes, either as negotiators or mediators, or even as civil society groups sort of pushing from the outside, when those peace agreements are signed, they last longer. They tend to last anywhere from 2 to 15 years longer, which, most peace agreements fall apart in 5 years anyway. So we're looking at a way to really ensure much more stability in peace processes. And I think, one of the things I would just say as a former U.S. government official is I think we can do is ensure that we are enforcing the law that is on the books right now in the U.S. called the Women, Peace, and Security Act, that really calls for the U.S. to, on its own, but also push for more women at high level, in high level delegations and in peace processes around the world. We, did not really do that in Afghanistan. I would say if you looked out, there were 4 women who were part of the discussions around what was to happen in Afghanistan, but we didn't, as the U.S., really push that out and as much as we should have, given the law that is in place in the books and the fact it's good practice.
You mentioned...
Yeah. I don't know if you want to say more. You usually.
No.
Susan and I, we have a little bit of a back and forth sometimes. But we'll get to that. Okay.
You mentioned Sweden, 2014. What drove that, and why was Sweden the first country?
Well, they have a history of working on gender equality throughout their political and social system. They were early on adopters of parental leave, equal pay, gender equality with a quota in their political system. So they had both a societal support for it and government experience on working on gender equality. So when Margaret Wallström became the foreign minister, she declared a feminist foreign policy and then worked during her term to implement it, putting out guidance for the workers in the Foreign Affairs Department and all these sorts of things. The problem was, we think when the new government took over just last year, their first act, well, two, they said, we support Ukraine and we're doing away with feminist foreign policy. So she had not really created kind of a greater political coalition to support feminist foreign policy, both with the public and in the government. And so it's to be seen how much it can be undone after that many years. But one thing that we found is that often these countries, it's a single person or just a few people that are declaring feminist foreign trade or development or whatever it is. And so that a need for it to be more sustainable over a long time is really building a broader coalition to support it.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you what the general response has been and how many countries have done it. I was talking to David Loyne, who was a BBC reporter in Afghanistan for many, many years. And he was at a meeting at the, I guess it was the meeting at the Swedish ambassador's event. And the Swedish foreign minister, who must have been the person you were talking about, was there. This is, I'm not sure exactly what year, and the German ambassador was also there, and she was talking about the need for the feminist foreign policy, and the German ambassador sort of banged the table and said, we need a masculine foreign policy.
Like every other foreign policy is not masculine.
Well, it's interesting because I know you told me that story last night, and what I said in response is that Germany now has a feminist foreign policy, so there you go.
They've switched.
Yes, but I think so. In terms of the response, in 2014, these three words were put together, right? Feminist foreign policy for the first time, and a few countries kind of picked it up, but there's been quite an acceleration in the last, I'd say, 4 to 5 years with countries that aren't just in Europe or just the countries we think about when we have, again, word association with gender equality. So Colombia has adopted a feminist foreign policy. We've all, countries that are Mexico, Chile, so countries in the sort of more developing part of the world. And we're seeing really, I think, kind of an expansion of the concept and much more and more sort of governments really trying to figure out what this means and how they can implement it. I would also say, I think it's important to distinguish between the following. There are countries that say they have a feminist foreign policy, and I think maybe it's really more of just a statement of intention. There are countries that have a feminist foreign trade or development policy that I think are doing a lot to get there. And I think, I always say this, I think our neighbor to the north, Canada, is one of the countries that's sort of in that, trying to really do the most to push it forward. And then you have countries that I think don't say or acknowledge or would want to say they have a feminist foreign policy, but work for more gender equality in terms of their foreign policy. I would put the U.S. there. I think we aren't doing enough. I think we have far to go. But I think, there's sort of a continuum again about it's not just enough in my mind to say you have a feminist foreign policy. We need to judge countries on what they're actually doing.
And I would say civil society is very mixed on the response to feminist foreign policy. I think that in implementing it in many countries, it has not lived up to the bold name of feminist foreign policy. For instance, Sweden, while it had a feminist foreign policy, continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So at what point do you actually change other aspects of your foreign policy to address gender equality? And selling arms to a country that is one of the most or worst places for women in the world, that's very difficult to figure out how the same ministry was doing both of those things. So I think civil society overall is trying to push governments to do more. And part of using the word feminist, they are making a statement that they are going to be bold. They aren't just going to do gender-informed foreign policy. They're actually going to be feminist. And so I think overall, while governments, it's varied. academics and people outside the governments have not been as satisfied by just naming it.
I will say one other thing. I'm going next week to a conference on feminist foreign policy put on by the Dutch government, which has a feminist foreign policy. But I think these conferences are really starting to take hold, where people, governments, civil society, academia are coming together to, again, question, what this really means, understand better what implementation means, and then push forward. I mean, some of the sessions are, what I kind of think of as implementation, and then some are sort of like really very blue sky. So it will be an interesting thing to see how all these various entities kind of come together to talk about this under the auspices of the Dutch government.
Is there any coordination between a domestic policy and whether it be government related or whether it be industry related, for gender equality and to their this feminist foreign policy? I mean, can you say that the countries who have a feminist foreign policy also are much better internally?
It varies. I think the countries that have declared a feminist foreign policy fall into two camps. One, like Sweden, that have a long history of gender equality and feminist activities in their countries. And then this new group that's coming out are people who don't have that long history, but they are, I don't want to say this in a bad way, but they're literally willing to try anything, right? They're going to be radical, they're going to be feminist because their foreign policy and their women's rights have been so neglected for a while. So they are trying to be bold in order to kind of jumpstart that sort of movement, both internally and externally.
Now, we know that not all women are good and not all men are bad.
That is true.
But I read two books recently that I thought were very interesting. One was called The Game of Queens, which is about 16th century politics and women's roles. So it includes people like Isabella of Castile, who was very definite that she wanted to remain control of her own area, to Marguerite of, Marguerite of Austria and what's her name in France, and the message is that while the men were off fighting wars, in the Austro-Hungary, the Habsburgs and whatever, that they trusted the women to maintain their power, the males, because they were the mentor to the child, or they were, whereas they wouldn't, if you were the emperor and you were a duke, you would be more likely to take her place, whereas the woman would be more likely to protect it, which I thought was really interesting. The other book is called When Women Rule the World, and it's about the 6 queens of Egypt. And they also were generally put into place when there was a lot of strife. And the women, they could either have been, the guardian for the child. But I thought, it was reading those two books back to back, I thought, what do we know about women leaders and have they generally been more peacekeeping and more treaty making? What do we know about that? I know you're not historians, but
well, I mean, I would say it is true, right? Not every woman is a feminist, and not every feminist is a woman. And also, there's a whole issue about how do we look at who women leaders are? There are women leaders who are, conservative. Margaret Thatcher, the perfect example. She also started a war in the Falklands, or the Marianas, however we talk about it. So I think we do have to understand this is complex. And Bangladesh, there are these 2 women who have been prime minister off and on for forever. And that's a different dynamic because it's a lot about family dynasties. So I think women leaders, it's very complicated. I think what we've seen in the US is that for a long time, and globally, a lot of women who were in leadership positions were there because of their families. They were from well-known political families. In this country, we always say Barbara Mikulski, who I worked for, and Jenny's here and worked for her too. She was the first Democratic woman to be elected that a man did not have to die for her to be in office, right? She didn't succeed her husband, her brother, her father, whatever. So I think that's changing, but for a long time, a lot of these women leaders were from these dynastic families, whether it was the monarchy or, fairly famous families around the world. So I think we know that kind of the texture of who women leaders are is changing. And then I think, we see that a lot of places women are able to push forward. I think if we look at like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, she was a very different kind of leader because she was willing to really talk about her personal life and the struggles she faced. And I think we're just seeing different kinds of women coming to the forefront.
But that is very recent.
Yes.
Because in a democracy, women were acting like men in order to get elected. People around the world, men and women, are uncomfortable with women's political leadership. And so for a long time, women, think about the suits we wore in the 80s, right? We wore those little crazy ties.
I made those.
Yeah, we really were trying to look as much like men as possible. They were often, not wanting to be like the woman candidate, right? Where you're saying you're for the ERA and women's rights and these sorts of things. And so it's been a long transition in order for women to really feel like they can be authentic and talk about their families and the issues that they care about, because they continue to be judged differently by society.
That brings up a lot of other questions that, in terms of your image, and which I don't want to go into at the moment. But so what about the U.S.? And what about, why don't we have, I want to make a comment, which is, it's interesting to me that Germany only adopted the feminist foreign policy after Angela Merkel.
But they had the change of government.
Which
So
is-
a different political party came into power.
Which is really interesting. So why don't we have one, and what are we going to do about that?
Sure. And I would say, just to touch on that point you made about Germany, I think this is the interesting question, right? To me, there are many interesting questions here. One is how you institutionalize feminist foreign policy, because like in Germany, like in Sweden, who gets elected matters. And if you are in the Swedish foreign ministry and there's a change in government, you were moving along towards a feminist foreign policy, and all of a sudden you're not supposed to be doing that anymore. If you're in the German foreign ministry, you're doing your job, you're probably figuring out how to advance women, but now there's sort of an additional push on a feminist foreign policy. So
That's true in the U.S. too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do know that. I do know that. I was getting there. Okay.
Okay.
But I think that's the question. I think we have to be honest, right? This is a somewhat controversial set of policy choices that governments make. It's not like it's universally like everyone's going to go out and develop a feminist foreign policy. The word feminist is imbued with things it doesn't really mean, but it is politicized. And so I say that to mean that I think this discussion of policy moving forward is embedded in our systems of politics around the world. So for the U.S., obviously that's true, right? We've had, I think, a commitment to focusing on women in foreign policy, at least since the Beijing conference in 1995. Certainly Secretary Clinton, and we write about this in the book, I think really was instrumental in pushing forward the issues around focusing on gender in foreign policy and making sure to listen to women around the world and bring them more into what diplomats do every day. But that's not the same as sort of transforming the system and having a more, a focus on gender and feminism every day. I don't know why we don't. I worked in the State Department. There are some people here who work in the State Department, worked or do work in the State Department. I think there's a really strong push to try to focus more on gender, women, peace, and security. I don't know that there's appetite to call whatever we're doing a feminist foreign policy in the U.S., given sort of where we are politically. But I think we've made progress from the first time I was at the State Department to the second, I felt like there was much more buy-in around the importance of this issue. But I think the reality is making sure there are enough resources and people who have the skills who can push this forward. And now Susan is going to say something that's a little bit different, I think.
No, I'm not going to disagree. I mean, obviously the U.S. government is also different than any other government in the world. And the role that we play in global security, it continues to be the largest in the world, right? And so the role that we play, in order to say that, we would need a fundamental change in our foreign policy structure in the U.S. government. And we are not willing to go there when we are right now, involved in 2 conflicts and keeping our eye on the Indo-Pacific region for a potential third, that we, I don't think, have. I would think that they would say, maybe you can tell me at the State Department, that they don't have the luxury of doing this. I would argue that if we had been bold over the past decades, we probably, or maybe would not be in the situation where we are in these conflicts around the world. But at this point, I feel like we, the US government, unlike a smaller government like a Sweden or even Canada, we don't have the luxury of trying a experimental and bold foreign policy.
So you both spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. And what we read at the time was that the education of women and the giving women more rights was a key part of why we were there. Is that true? And what was Afghanistan really like? What you talked about yesterday was really interesting. What was it really like, and how progressive was Kabul versus the Helmand province? And how much of the quote-unquote feminist foreign policy was driving our efforts in Afghanistan?
Well, let me talk a little bit about girls' education, and then you can jump in on the Afghanistan part. So girls' education is a revolutionary idea. Every year that a girl stays in school, she is more likely to marry later, have her first child later. Her children are more likely to be able to read and grow up healthy. And so every year that girls stay in school around the world can change that country. Not just her life, her family's life, her community, and the whole country. I mean, that's why if you think about in a lot of these places where authoritarians come into place, the first thing they do is kick the girls out of school. They know it's an issue for them. And so they understand. And so I don't think that's why we were in Afghanistan. I think it was a good illustration of what we were trying to do there. But certainly we were not just working on girls' education, but women's economic empowerment. I did a lot of work with women running for office there, both in Kabul and around the world. So we did a full array of programs there, but girls' education was certainly key. And it's one of the flashpoints now, so many girls trying to get out of Afghanistan so that they can continue their education.
Yeah, because obviously, I'm sure you all know this, in Afghanistan today, girls can't go to school over 6th grade, and in some places over 3rd grade. So depending on where they live. Although in some places they apparently are still going to school much later, but basically nationwide, it's the girls are barred after 6th grade. Just in Afghanistan, I mean, I said a couple of things, which I always say when people ask me the question, what was it like being in Afghanistan? And my answer, after I really sort of try to think about it in a really complicated way, and then I realized the easiest thing to say is that I met people who lived in lots of different centuries at the same time. Like people lived in there were people living in probably the 9th century and the 10th century and the 12th century and the 21st at the same time in that country, because the country is low literacy rates for women, but they're not so great for men either. It's a very rural country. It's hard for some people, for people out in the hinterland to, even be connected. It's better now, obviously, not now, but it was better before the fall of Kabul, because I think there was more access to like the internet and cell phones. But I don't think, it's a country that's very complicated, and the sort of the thing often people said about the president of Afghanistan was that he was really the mayor of Kabul. Like, really, he controlled Kabul. The rest of the country, not so much, although they did have a very centralized government where actually the president of Afghanistan appoints all the governors. They're not elected in their provinces. But still, it's a very, it's a challenging place, and I think it was a hard place to work. But I think the challenge is also just thinking about all the change that the people that Afghans have lived through. If you're my age, you've lived through probably monarchy, a republic, communism, the Taliban, democracy, the Taliban. Right? It's a lot of upheaval, and how we navigate that and help women really be able to fully participate in a post-Taliban world, I think, is a big question.
So the fundamental question I have is, feminism has a lot of negative connotations and a lot of backlash. Is there a word that, if you were building it today, is there a word that you would use instead of feminist foreign policy?
We talked a lot about this because feminism does have negative connotations. Not universally, though. We did do some polling on it. But the problem is to replace feminism, you would need 17 words, right? So believe in gender equality, believe, in all these sorts of things. And so it has already been established as kind of the phrase that's used. So now that other people are adopting it, it would be very bold of us to think that we can change the wording or the branding around it. And I think feminist, it actually captures the point of it is to change society, change structures so that people of all genders can have their full rights.
Because I was thinking about human foreign policy,
But it's the gender equality which is so key. When half of our population does not have equal access to resources and their rights, that is a fundamental problem. So the gender equality, because human security, is very important. Obviously, it's a main tenet of feminist foreign policy. But we just feel, or people who are fighting for feminist foreign policy feel that it is obviously the very first principle of it.
There's some words that you read and hear that sort of crystallize, problems. And one of them for me was water wives. And water wives are in Africa are places where there is no great access to water. So men marry women who will just carry the water from point A to point B, maybe miles. So she's a water wife. I mean, talk about.
And girls do that too. I mean, that's that whole issue of oftentimes girls are not going to school because they're seen as important to all those tasks at home. Yeah.
So given the challenges that we have, which are real, I mean, and every day is a new challenge and a more serious one in a way. What would you recommend to the Biden administration to move forward, or at this moment in time? Oh, by the way, I want to ask you, what percentage of the people in the State Department are women, of the policymakers? About?
I mean, I think when we have some statistics in the book about women ambassadors, and it kind of goes up and down because, most ambassadors are career people, and then some smaller number are political appointees. And in the Trump administration, the political appointee number went much higher up, and in the Biden administration, it's come much further down. So I think the number we cite is like 35% of the ambassadors are women. I don't know the data, like specifically looking across at like the most senior leadership of the State Department. Certainly, Wendy Sherman left. She was the second highest ranking person at the State Department. And she currently, there's an acting person in that job who's a woman, but it sounds like President Biden is going to nominate a man. So in the top three positions at the State Department, the secretary and the two deputies, I mean, right now there's two men who have been confirmed, Tony Blinken, Rich Verma, and then Toria Nuland is acting. And she probably won't, she's not going to be in that position, assumedly, very much longer. So it's kind of, it changes at the top, but I think it's certainly gotten much better than it used to be.
And so what would you recommend, if you were his advisor for feminist foreign policy, what would you recommend that he do?
Well, I mean, I think really, so, I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot that I think is really important, they're sort of, these, I feel like this is very much in the weeds, but I'll just go ahead. You know, there is an office, that Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. I worked there. And then in some bureaus and some embassies, there are gender advisors, right? Somebody whose job it is to push forward within their office. I did that job at the Office of the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts. And I think it's important to make sure that in every bureau, every embassy, every part of the State Department, not just in the office that's tasked with caring about gender, that there are people whose job it is to ask the questions every day and push forward. I think you make a big difference when you're within part of the State Department that isn't just a gender office, because you understand how that office works, you understand the imperatives, and you sort of see where you can really make change. I also think really important that we mandate that there be gender analysis of every single foreign policy decision that gets made, whether there is a differential. I think there probably is on every one, but we really need to know that. The president needs to have a gender analysis in his daily brief every day for every decision. And so those are like the two key things. I think it does come down to, at the bottom sort of line is, you know, we need to keep pushing inside to create more and more political will that this is the right thing to do, no matter who's there, no matter who the secretary is, no matter who the president is. And you only do that by like doing this every day and really pushing forward and helping people understand who are doing the jobs every day that this makes their job easier and that they see an impact from what gets done.
I would say an umbrella over that is actual real resources, right? If you look at the budget, and that shows what the president cares about. And even though this president is spending more money on gender equality than any other president, it is tiny, right? It's like couch cushion coins from the Defense Department. And so if the president was thinking about rebalancing the work we do with the military versus other aspects of our government, you know, having relationships with other countries, he would put resources toward that. He would put resources towards the personnel that would need to do the gender analysis and serve as gender advisors. He would put the resources towards. So my main thing is just, we need real money, and that could make, it shows the political will, and it makes makes policymakers in his administration and on Capitol Hill have real discussions about what this means for us.
So I'm going to ask you this question two ways. If you could go out 5 years or 10 years, what would you hope to see versus, and what do you think is the most realistic picture?
In the U.S. or
Globally.
I have to say that in the next, before the end of next year, there will be a political election in this country. And if Donald Trump wins, it will not only affect the U.S. government, but it will very much impact what's going on in Ukraine. And that could change the whole world. If we do not remain supportive of Ukraine, and Ukraine falls, and Russia is on the NATO border, our whole world is going to be different. And so we will not have control over many decisions because we will be 100% focused on that. And you better believe if our commitment to Ukraine falters, China is seeing that. And what they are going to be doing will be even more aggressive in the Indo-Pacific. And so we can get back to the positive stuff in a second. But the reality is that we are making a huge decision, not just for our country, but the whole world within the next year.
I mean, the only thing I would say is, if you look out 5 to 10 years, I think two things are true. There are elections everywhere, well, not everywhere, but in many places, and in many places that currently have a feminist foreign policy or might think about adopting it. So again, this is sort of tied into what goes on in the political sphere in countries. Canada's going to have an election. Who knows what's going to happen there, and that's going to have an impact on their policy as well. I do think the positive part of it, and I agree that who is president in the United States will have a really big impact on the world and in many ways, but is that I do think this concept, this idea, is very interesting to people, because I think one thing that I hear so many people saying is, you know, we need new ways of thinking about foreign policy. The traditional ways have their limitations. Some people will say they totally don't work, but I'm going to say they have their limitations. And I think feminist foreign policy is a new idea that people see as maybe being something that helps us move forward in a way we weren't able or haven't been able to move forward when we didn't focus on the importance of gender equality. So I think this is an idea that I think in 10 years will be even more, I think, in the kind of mainstream discussion in foreign policy. I think more countries will likely have adopted it, but I think it's something that's very, very interesting to people in foreign policy and outside of foreign policy, because I think it does kind of bring together, and this is a question you asked before, but it brings together our focus domestically on, you know, women and gender equality, and our focus globally. And it kind of makes that point that what we do at home is how we're judged around the world too. So I think it's very fluid, but I do think in 10 years probably there'll be much more of a conversation about this. More than 16 countries will be talking about it, or having one, having a feminist policy.
So questions from the floor.
Oh, come on.
Yes.
I spent all this time writing it out, and are you going to read it? No,
I tell you what, go ahead.
no, I'm joking. Great job. So how does feminist foreign policy look at the use of military force?
The question was?
How does the use of
Yeah.
how does feminist foreign policy
Yeah.
look at the use of military force?
So the
Many
question.
people conflate, I think often conflate feminism with pacifism. So my question is, would it result in a different approach to military force, a more limited use of force, or a completely new approach to how and when military force is utilized?
So do you want to restate the question?
Sure. I mean, the question is
microphone.
about how feminist foreign policy looks at the use of military force, and the comment that Jenny has is that some people conflate feminism with pacifism, and you're basically asking if that's the case, and or how would a feminist foreign policy address and perhaps change our use of military force.
So interestingly, out of the 15 or 16 countries that have announced a feminist foreign something, only one specifically talks about peace, and that's Colombia. Whereas I think we went in thinking that it might be across all of them. And so they have it as a goal of their feminist foreign policy is peace. I do believe if you're implementing a feminist foreign policy, you are going to rebalance and not think that, as someone said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail, right? And so when you have spent billions of dollars on weapons and training people to fight war, you think, oh, let's just move them into this and fix the problem this way. But if you invest in other ways of talking to people, promoting and defending human rights, helping other countries become secure economically, health-wise, all these other issues, if you think differently about what our goals are, then maybe we can prevent the conflict, right? Instead of creating a generation of young men and women in the Middle East that hate America because that we were in their countries against their will, using force to try to keep order there. So I think it would change. I think it would be, if we really went to the full extent of feminist foreign policy, you would fundamentally change the structure of government to think more about that. In the short term, it would just be moving some of our resources around, both personnel and budget-wise, to create more tools to engage with other people. I mean, that's the other thing. One way the world is changing is that a lot of foreign policy now is not just government to government. Mm-hmm. There are so many growing entities that are impacting the security of people around the world that don't have a leader that you can call on the phone or build a long-term relationship with. So we have to adjust to this growing reality as well about security and non-state actors.
And the only thing I would add in terms of the rebalancing is I think, we all heard this quote from various high-level military people over the years, but I think it continually gets reinforced that I think our military leaders would say and do say that, every dollar we invest in diplomacy and development means they don't have to spend as much money on what they do, right? And that they understand that at times a military response is warranted, but there are times where we probably don't need to have a military response if we had invested more in diplomacy and development. And by the way, which I feel like we should say, maybe here's a good point, we always talk a lot about the State Department, USAID, and DOD as being the big players, but we have a lot of other parts of our government that are outward facing, that are sort of part of our foreign policy apparatus and how we interact with other governments around trade, the Peace Corps, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which also does development assistance. And so broadening that out also and understanding there are other parts of the government in the non-defense sector that also play a really critical role. And, I think Canada especially and Norway have really focused on feminist trade policy, because understanding that obviously economic growth is critical to stability. And so those entities are also important as we're talking about how we rebalance, like how we actually look across all the levers that we have as, the people who are supposed to be helping the president, the vice president, et cetera, make decisions about where our country goes.
Other questions? I must say that I was struck by a photograph in the paper this morning of a woman with 4 or 5 children sitting around her, whose husband had been killed in Maine, in the shooting in Maine. And I looked at that picture and I thought, how much of the damage of war falls on women and children? Yes, men get killed, but who's left to pick up the pieces? And to me, that's a really important part of this. Do we make war? Do women make war? But how much of the debris of war falls on women and children?
Well, it's greater than it's ever been. Last year, more civilians were killed in conflict than soldiers. So it's not like World War I where they go off to a field and they just shoot each other and then they go back. It's in their towns, right? People sitting at a diner, there's a missile launched and it kills everyone in the place. I mean, there's no lines anymore.
But the other thing about that is it's not, I think this is true in crises generally. So climate, obviously we are living in a time of great climate crisis. And the majority of climate refugees are women. Vast majority, women and children. And so I think we see that crises, whether it's conflict or climate, tend to affect the most vulnerable. They tend to affect civilians, obviously in conflict, but it's also looking more broadly, that understanding that even in something that doesn't seem like it's a war, it's a crisis certainly, but women are much disproportionately affected by climate-related matters, given what they, where they live, what they do in the community, and the fact that they tend to end up moving more as refugees. So I think we which is why I think it's super important. And again, I know I'm a little bit of a, JD one note on this, but really important to keep asking those questions, like what are the differential impacts on men and women, boys and girls, et cetera. I mean, you can use any iteration you want, but I think until we, keep asking those questions, or as we keep asking those questions, I think we can help illuminate the problem, and that helps us hopefully develop solutions that actually get at what people need on the ground, and that we ask them. I mean, I think one thing maybe, which is a good way to kind of, I think, focus on the importance of in feminist foreign policy, and arguably this is just common sense. So, but it's important for us, or the people who are in these positions in foreign policy and development, particularly to really talk to people on the ground and figure out, like, what are the solutions that they see, what are the challenges that they face, and how we can then take that information in, as opposed to saying, that we know kind of what better. We know better because of, we're whatever. But I think it's really imperative to think about how do we ensure that the decisions that get made at the highest levels, at the everyday level, are informed by the people who are impacted by those decisions. Not to say that the U.S. government or any government will do everything that any group of people are asking, but it's imperative, I think, that we understand.
So we have a Sunday afternoon Zoom call with a group of friends, and my job, and we discuss the problems of the day or the challenges of the day or things that are interesting. My job is at the end to have good news. So if I were to ask you, how can we end this conversation on a positive note, what would your answer be?
Well, I mean, look, I think, and I'm an optimist, that anyone in this room who knows me, and I always think I'm looking for the good news, but I do think, and I always, I look back and think about, sort of when I started as a young woman in my career, and then today, and sort of looking at the greater policy landscape. And I do think, despite all the ups and downs, and there have been many in this country and around the world, I think there is a march towards gender equality. I think, and to bring it to pop culture, because what the heck, but it is true, right? The three biggest sort of cultural drivers this year and economic drivers in this country have been three women, right? Two of them are real people, Beyonce and Taylor Swift, and one is a doll that actually has sort of a complicated history, Barbie. But Barbie is recast as a feminist icon, and her movie is phenomenally successful. And I think what that says to me is there's sort of a cultural kind of that for all the. I mean, obviously, I think laws are important and policy. I'm a lawyer, but I also think cultural change is important, and the way we think about women and girls and their role in this world. And I think women who are much younger than I think about their lives very differently, and they ask very different things, and they demand more of us. Maybe because I think we opened the door for them, but I think they do, and I think they're asking questions, sometimes very uncomfortable. I've been asked some very uncomfortable questions about my career by young women, but you know what? I think that's good, because I do think it's like people are really searching for how to have a life that is much more of an equal life, and I think that's happening at the same time the world is kind of falling apart around us, but hopefully that helps us build back at some point in a more positive way.
Yes, for sure. I agree. Young people, young men and women around the world are thinking very differently about issues from climate change to gender equality. And my children are, college age, and I'll say something and they're like, "Yeah, Mom, duh." Like, of course, that's true. And I was like, "Are you?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's just fundamental." Their sense of justice and equality and their willingness to get angry and go think of creative ways to fight for it. It's just amazing, and it gives me hope every day.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I'm sort of surprised that you haven't mentioned this, and that is the easy availability of contraception for women. In many, many countries, it's not easily available.
So the question is,
How does it fit in?
how,
It has to fit in someplace.
how does the lack of availability of contraceptives in many countries, how does that fit into this?
Well, it's a huge part of the work that U.S. government does around the world with our global health programs, because we do feel that if a woman cannot control when and how many children she has, it impacts every other aspect of her life. You can't really do economic empowerment or fight violence or think about politics if you are just having children one after another. And so we work with men and women around the world to control it. It literally changed, right, millions of women's lives in the United States when the pill became legal and easily available. And so it is so fundamental to that. And we talk about it a little bit in the book about part of the growing gender rights movement here in the 70s and that sort of thing. So it is fundamental. But interestingly, reproductive rights, only in a couple places has that been talked about as part of the foreign policy, right? Can you? Civil society presses for it.
I think like Norway, Norway was very big on focusing on advocating for more broader access to contraception and other, reproductive rights as part of their foreign policy, as part of their engagement at the UN. They're the one country that has really pushed for that. Of the countries that have developed a feminist foreign policy, they were very explicit about that, and that they've been advocating, at the UN, other multilateral institutions to really push forward on more access to every kind of reproductive health care service.
Yeah.
I want to thank you all for coming and thank our audience. We will put this on the YouTube, so we'll post it on the YouTube. So it will be available, so you can forward it to people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That would be bold if someone said reproductive.